The fire didn't burn bright. It flickered, as if unsure whether to live or die, like a pulse caught between two beats waiting to choose a rhythm. And that flicker in July of 1918 hovered in the dense woods behind a house no longer marked on modern maps. Somewhere beneath the black pines of Yekaterinburg, something was extinguished, but no one agreed on what exactly was lost. They called it the House of Special Purpose, not a palace, not a prison, not a sanctuary, just a waiting room for the end of something ancient. Inside its plain walls, time bent in silence. The Romanovs, once called autocrats of all the Russias, were no longer sovereigns, but they weren't civilians either. What they were in that liminal space between dynasty and disappearance remains unclear. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, all reduced to whispers. Photographs later smudged at the edges, names spoken too carefully or not at all. One name lingered longer than the others. Anastasia. She was the youngest daughter, not the heir, not the favorite. But there was something about her name that refused to settle, like smoke from a candle not fully snuffed. And maybe that's how it began, not with a scream or a gunshot, but with a subtle misalignment, a gap, a pause in the breath of history. The official report claimed finality. Executed, all of them. Bullets and bayonets in the cellar. Quick, brutal, inevitable. Bodies buried in a shallow pit in the forest, treated with acid fire and secrecy. But secrets do not die easily, especially not when buried with royalty. Witnesses disagreed. Some said the girls survived the first volley, that the smoke had choked the executioners, that chaos had muddled the count. 11 people, 9 bullets, too many cries, not enough silence. And when silence finally came, the timeline began to unravel. Documents were redacted, autopsies delayed, graves misplaced. Some things, even in the age of cameras and war, were too quiet to verify. In Europe, whispers gathered around dinner tables and in drawing rooms, rumors crossing borders faster than trains. Anastasia had escaped. A servant had smuggled her out. She was recovering in a convent. She was married to a nobleman in Paris. She had drowned. She had lived. She had forgotten her name. And then came the faces. Women stepping forward, each claiming memory, each declaring that the fire had spared them, that they had once been a Romanov, that they had known the weight of diamonds sewn into corsets and the sound of bayonets scraping stone. But which was truth, which a trick of light? The more questions were asked, the more the past lost shape. History became soft around the edges, a fog where even the facts forgot where they began. Artifacts were recovered, charred bone fragments, buttons, teeth, and tested. Again and again. Scientists argued over mitochondrial strands and isotopic decay. Some bones fit too easily, others not at all. Time blurred forensic lines. Faith clashed with DNA. Some said the Soviets hid the real grave, that the execution was staged, that 2 children escaped and were protected by loyalists, that documents were destroyed not for secrecy, but for survival. But no one could say why the questions persisted long after the empire had crumbled. Why the myth of one girl mattered more than the end of an entire dynasty. Was it the name Anastasia? Greek for resurrection, a coincidence too poetic to ignore. Or was it that humans, when faced with the absolute reach for cracks, because cracks offer possibilities. And so the world listened quietly to the sound of a story refusing to die. A story that had no beginning, no middle, and no clean end. Only a slow, irregular flicker at the edge of the map. Something extinguished, or maybe something waiting. A horse-drawn carriage once traced its way through the forest trails of the Ural's wheels crackling over frost-hardened ground. No one remembers the horses. No one speaks of the driver. But somewhere in the silence that followed the summer of 1918, there were tracks left behind. They led away from the Ipatiev house, and they never returned. The official route of death was supposed to be straight, from cellar to grave, from name to number. But then came the detour, a night-long journey through thick woods. A convoy paused and scattered, reports of breakdowns, muffled arguments, a second site of burial, or a first or neither. Even the trees seemed uncertain. In the Soviet archives, those reluctantly opened after the fall of the Union, the testimonies stutter. One guard claimed 2 girls were still alive when loaded into the cart. Another swore they were unconscious but breathing. A third said one had escaped only to be recaptured before dawn. The statements never align. Their margins contradict. Why would executioners in an age of efficiency and terror bungle a task so grimly rehearsed? Some say the bullets jammed, that the diamond corsets beneath the royal dresses acted like armor, that the smoke and blood and panic made precision impossible, that the children, some only half-grown, wouldn't die when expected. And so a pause, a whisper among guards, a quiet decision never recorded, to move the bodies, or to move only some. No names appear in these footnotes, only euphemisms, subjects, cargo, biological remains. But what if there had been a switch, a decoy wrapped in royal silk, a miscount in the chaos? The carriage was never found. Neither the horses nor the harnesses were traced. Only the tracks in the soil recorded in photographs that vanished from the official files by 1935. A few remained water-stained, scratched, archived in foreign collections, where Russian was no longer the language of memory. And then there were the shoes. At the edge of the supposed burial site, a pair of small leather shoes was discovered. Black, laced, too clean, too untouched by the violence of the previous night. Experts dated them to the late spring of 1918. They bore the stitching marks of a Petrograd artisan, but no traces of blood, no signs of wear. They were placed, not discarded, as if someone had been instructed to begin walking. Could Anastasia have been led away, or was it someone else wearing her name like a mask? Was the carriage a rescue, or a second sentence? Among the trees, time folds inward. Soldiers lost their memory. Locals forgot the path. Directions shifted like compasses without true north. And always at the center of the confusion, a gap too wide to cross, too narrow to see clearly. When the Bolsheviks finally admitted decades later that the Romanovs had been killed, they spoke only in generalities. The location remained vague, the identities uncertain. Even the motives political-practical dissolved in passive verbs. Not executed, removed, not buried, relocated. Some scholars believe the truth lies not in what was said, but in what was delayed. It took over 60 years for the grave to be found, another decade to examine it. And still, 2 bodies missing. Always 2. Theories multiplied like fungi in the dark, a second burial site to the west, known only to a vanished priest, an underground chamber in an abandoned monastery, a child smuggled in the belly of a hay cart under forged documents and a lullaby. And yet despite the silence, a name persisted in telegrams, in letters written in hurried ink in asylum applications across Europe: Anastasia. Sometimes Anna, sometimes Anya, sometimes only A. Was it desperation? A hunger for continuity in a continent that had lost its kings? Or was there something else? A signal in the noise? A shadow crossing borders under forged dawns? In one recovered letter, unsigned, unsent, a line reads, "The girl knew no hymns, but remembered every chandelier." It is dated 1922. Location, Vienna. Who sent it to whom, and why did it survive the purge? The carriage that left the Ipatiev house never returned. But its tracks, they remain faint and fragile in the margins of maps and memories. Not enough to follow. Just enough to wonder. What walks in silence leaves no proof, only the shape of a question. Beneath the floorboards of the Ipatiev house, the air did not move. The walls, stripped of their paper and portraits, bore only silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the waiting hush before an answer no one wished to receive. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a halo too dim to sanctify. They were told to descend, all of them, the Tsar, the Tsarina, the children, 4 daughters and 1 sickly son, along with their doctor, their cook, their maid, and their valet. 11 souls, 11 bodies, 11 futures folded inward. The guards spoke little. They read a statement. It was short, almost ritualistic, accusation without trial, judgment without voice, history without hesitation. Then gunfire, sharp, jagged, not in unison, not clean. Some historians speak of a botched execution, weapons misfiring, smoke thickening, bullets ricocheting off bone and gems, screams, staggered deaths, a scene not of closure but of confusion. The Tsarevich was shot last. The children did not die quickly. The corsets, laced with jewels sewn in for safekeeping, deflected the first shots. Bayonets were used, later fire, acid, lime. But what truly died in that room? Not just bodies, not merely blood. A certainty was extinguished, the belief in continuity in lineage, in the neat procession of crowns to coffins. No official photographs exist of the aftermath, only conflicting testimonies. Some guards refused to speak. Others spoke too freely, their memories inconsistent. One described Anastasia crawling along the floor, dazed, whispering something that no one understood. Another insisted she had already fallen. Another said she gasped a name that didn't belong to any present. They were all present. And yet some later accounts suggest otherwise, that a girl had vanished between cellar and cart, that a body did not match a name, that a daughter, just one, had remained still and breathing long after the noise had stopped. Who would notice amid the smoke and cries if a single figure remained uncounted? There were 11 bodies, but numbers blur under pressure. Photographs of the basement taken years later show markings on the walls, scorched spots, holes, scratches. Interpretations vary. Some say they are bullet impacts. Others say they were made after the fact part of reconstruction, a mimicry of memory. One mark is shaped like a cross. Another resembles the letter A, but symbols like memories reshape themselves under scrutiny. The room was sealed, then demolished, stones sold, dust scattered. Why the haste? Why the silence? The Soviet government did not acknowledge the deaths until decades later. No graves were officially marked, no names inscribed, only denial. And in denial, space for doubt. For something not quite dead to begin whispering. And still a lingering question. If 11 people were executed, why did only 9 sets of remains emerge from the woods in 1991? Forensic reports were inconclusive. The bones were incomplete. 2 children missing. Possibly Anastasia and her brother. Possibly not. Later discoveries would claim to fill the gap more remains, another grave. But skepticism had already taken root. Too many years. Too many versions. Even the identities of the discovered bones were contested. DNA matched, then mismatched. One tooth chipped, another burned beyond recovery. Experts debated tooth alignment and femur lengths. The more science attempted to measure certainty, the more shadows shifted at the edges. What if one child was spared not by mercy, but by mistake? What if the last bullet jammed and someone looked away? What if she wasn't among the fallen? The cellar is gone now, paved over, reconstructed. A church stands in its place, all white walls and gold domes, its silence deeper than the original room. Pilgrims come. Some pray, others listen. For something. A murmur in stone. A sigh beneath tile. A name that slips between breaths. 11 echoes, 1 cellar, no end. And always the light bulb, still swinging. In a drawer once kept locked in a Bavarian chateau, archivists uncovered a photograph. Faded, yellowed, creased. 11 figures stood in quiet formation, their eyes too still. Someone sometime had sliced the paper with care. One figure gone, cleanly removed, not torn, not burned. Cut. Who was missing? The Romanovs had been photographed often, posed, painted in light. Their portraits, stiff with imperial tension, had adorned salons and newspapers across Europe. But after their exile to Tobolsk, the photographs grew rarer, grainier. Smiles gave way to stares, shadows grew thicker, and in some the shapes no longer matched the known accounts. A 1917 image shows Anastasia turned slightly away, face half lit. Her hand lifts perhaps mid-wave, perhaps mid-warning. Her eyes meet the lens, but not the viewer. Historians later debated whether the photo was retouched. A strand of hair too straight, a sleeve too sharp. Elsewhere, another photograph, anonymous, unsigned, emerged in a Paris antique shop in the 1930s. It depicts a girl resembling Anastasia, older, standing alone in a corridor, hands-gloved posture uncertain. The photo bears no date. On its reverse, a single word, erinert, remembered. Was it memory or mimicry? The Tsar's personal camera was never recovered. Some say it was buried with him. Others claim a guard sold it in Prague. A roll of undeveloped film allegedly surfaced in Zurich in 1949, undeclared at customs, destroyed before inspection. A hoax. A mistake, a silence preserved in celluloid. The problem with memory is not what it forgets, but what it repeats. In the years following the murders, visual records were doctored, faces blurred, uniforms altered. Entire figures vanished from official prints. The Soviet regime erased not only lives but the image of lineage, cropped royal children out of group portraits, repainted frames to match the narrative. But somewhere beyond the reach of state scissors, pieces survived, in trunks, in diaries, in letters never mailed. One note dated October 1918 speaks of a girl seen boarding a train at Ufa station, young, bruised, walking with a limp, dressed in borrowed clothes, holding nothing but a photograph, folded, edges frayed, and then nothing. Another letter, this one from a Red Cross nurse in Warsaw, mentions treating a Russian girl of noble accent who refused to sleep indoors, who whispered to herself in French and crossed herself backwards. The nurse was later transferred. The girl, unnamed. Were these stories, inventions, echoes, or shrapnel from a single detonation still ringing? At the Museum of Russian History in Geneva behind glass sits a photograph whose provenance is disputed. It depicts the Romanov daughters in white dresses, backs turned. One is clearly taller, one shorter. The alignment is wrong. The curator refuses to explain. Some call it mislabeling, others misdirection. But in torn photographs, there are always margins that never align. Why do some figures disappear more easily than others? Why does a sister vanish from the edge of the frame, while the rest remain clear? In St. Petersburg, a family once claimed to possess a portrait painted from life in 1921, a girl they called Nastya. They kept it behind a curtain, only showed it after dark. The signature on the canvas had been scrubbed away. Beneath the surface, faint outlines of wings. When questioned, they said nothing. Even paper has memory. The fibers warp with time. Emulsions decay unevenly. A missing image leaves residue traces of glue chemical ghosts. But these, too, are open to interpretation. One analyst using spectral analysis on a degraded image claimed to see outlines of a figure not present in the original. A shadow arm reaching out from a place no light should touch. Another saw nothing. Perhaps it is not the image that is flawed. Perhaps it is the gaze. As decades pass, more photographs surface. Some are verified, most are not. But in all of them, the same question echoes quietly beneath the static. Who cut her out and why? In the space where a face once was, the paper breathes differently. It is not absence, it is precision. In the belly of the Ural soil, ash doesn't lie still. It shifts with the frost. It seeps into the roots of crooked trees. And sometimes when the wind forgets which direction to move, it rises, not as smoke, but as suggestion, as the thin veil between fact and what cannot be placed. In 1979, two amateur historians working not on behalf of any government, but of a need they could not name, unearthed a grave outside Yekaterinburg. Shallow, marked by nothing but an uneven slope and a few scattered nails. What they found was fragmentary bone shards, teeth, pieces of skull. 9 bodies disordered, incomplete. They reburied the remains. Secretly, the world was not yet ready. It wasn't until 1991, after the Soviet collapse, that the grave was officially exhumed. Forensic teams arrived. Journalists circled. The bones were taken to laboratories. Age and sex were estimated. Trauma catalogued, cross-referenced against historical accounts. But something was missing. 2 somethings. Alexei, Anastasia, or Maria. The records, even those handwritten by the executioners, were vague. The daughters were sometimes interchangeable in memory, similar in stature, faces blurred in the minds of witnesses who had stopped looking. And yet, science demanded resolution. DNA testing began. Mitochondrial strands matched the royal line compared against the living relatives of Queen Victoria. Nicholas was identified. Alexandra, 3 of the girls, the servants, the doctor. But 2 remained unnamed, and the ash. There were traces of fire, yes, charred fabric, burned bone, a partial jaw blackened at the hinge. But not enough. Never enough. Some argued that the missing bodies had been destroyed. Others believed they had been buried elsewhere, deeper in the woods beneath a collapsed mine shaft or in the crawl space of an abandoned chapel. And then in 2007, new remains were found near the original site, smaller fragments, believed to be the Tsarevich and 1 daughter. But belief is not certainty. Even DNA under time and trauma begins to blur. Degradation introduces error. Teeth crack. Profiles distort. For every expert who declared the Romanov mystery resolved another pointed to inconsistencies. Markers that didn't fully match. Bones that didn't align. Discrepancies in the decay timeline. Could 1 child, just 1, have been misidentified? Could ash conceal not only death but survival? There was a theory whispered among archivists in Moscow that one of the daughters had been spared for diplomatic leverage, held, hidden, transferred west under forged documents, a pawn never played. A secret too volatile to admit, even after it no longer mattered. But such a theory leaves no trail, only the ghost of motive. Elsewhere at a lab in Sweden, a forensic anthropologist reviewing the osteological measurements from the remains noted that the 2 youngest skeletons were unusually difficult to distinguish. Damage obscured crucial features. The pelvic plates warped by fire. Tooth roots misaligned. He wrote in his notes, ambiguity lingers not in the science, but in what we expect it to solve. Still, the Russian Orthodox Church refused to canonize the remains until absolute proof was offered. The state claimed closure. The Church withheld recognition. And in that gap, doubt grew. For the faithful bones alone are not enough. For the skeptical, they are too easily manipulated. In a basement vault in St. Petersburg, a metal box contains the ash of the unidentified fragments. It is labeled simply Ekaterinburg Secondary Grave. No mention of names, no indication of resolution, only coordinates, only dust. They have never been buried. A question preserved in fire. Is ash the end of a story, or the part that cannot burn? There are faces that time forgets, quickly blurred into the folds of history, smudged by repetition, folded under new narratives. And then there are faces that linger not in portraits, but in the unlit spaces between memories. Anastasia's was one of these. Neither confirmed nor erased it hovered. Not in clarity, but in refusal. Refusal to resolve. Refusal to fit neatly into a coffin or a photograph or a tombstone. In the years following the execution, a peculiar phenomenon began. Across Europe, in quiet villages and crowded sanatoriums, people began to see her, or thought they did. A face in a train window. A girl wandering the gardens outside a convent in Belgium. A patient admitted to a Swiss hospital for nervous exhaustion, speaking Russian in her sleep, and refusing to answer to any name. None of these women claimed to be Anastasia. Not at first. It was others who whispered it first. The resemblance, the silence, the posture, the sorrow that seemed inherited, not acquired. And then came the ones who did claim. Dozens, perhaps more, stood before courts, journalists' relatives pleading belief. Each bore their own inconsistencies. Each offered partial truths, a remembered lullaby, a scar behind the ear, a knowledge of court etiquette no peasant could possess. Most were dismissed, frauds, escapists, women warped by grief or hunger or ambition. But there was one who stayed, Anna Anderson. She appeared in Berlin in 1920 after a failed suicide. No identification, no explanation. She was thin, pale, eyes wide and emptied of something essential. She was placed in a psychiatric hospital, spoke little, refused food. And when she finally did speak, it was in a halting mix of German, Russian, and English. The nurses were the first to wonder. Then the other patients. Then a visiting Russian émigré who claimed to recognize her voice. And from there, the rumor became declaration she was Anastasia, the lost duchess, the child of empire reborn. But recognition is a fragile currency. Some Romanov relatives visited and dismissed her immediately. Others were not so sure. She knew things she shouldn't. Details unrecorded in books, a childhood nickname, a hidden mole, the peculiar way Nicholas had held his cigar. And yet her accent was wrong, her manners inconsistent, her story fractured. She refused to speak of the execution, changed details, refused timelines, refused to explain how she had escaped. When pressed, she grew distant. Her gaze turned inward, not evasive but unreachable. Those who doubted called her a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, a woman with a history of trauma and mental illness. Family members were produced, comparisons drawn, documents examined. Still she persisted, not in argument but in presence. For decades, legal battles stretched across Europe, in courts and newspapers, in memoirs and interviews. Was she Anastasia, or just someone who needed to be? DNA testing in the 1990s, decades after her death, suggested she was not a Romanov. The tests matched her to Szankowska's relatives. The science seemed clear, final. And yet, the photograph remains, the one taken in 1923. Anna sitting beneath a tree face turned upward, half in shadow, and beside it a photo of Anastasia at age 16. The angle is similar. The mouth, the chin, the unmistakable tension of a young woman trained not to react too quickly. Facial recognition software suggests a high probability match. But is resemblance identity or simply symmetry? A human face carries so much that cannot be quantified. Grief, shame, memory, hope. These do not imprint on bone. They float in the soft spaces where software cannot read. In one of her last interviews, Anna was asked directly, "Are you Anastasia Romanov?" She smiled. She did not answer. Some said it was an admission, others a final performance. But that stubborn face continues to drift through the archive, unclaimed, unclosed. It does not vanish, it does not belong. It remains. She once said she remembered chandeliers more than faces. That she couldn't recall her mother's voice, but could describe in perfect detail the carved swan handles on the nursery doors of Tsarsko Selo. That pain comes not from forgetting, but from remembering things no one else will confirm. Anna Anderson lived most of her life under questions that never died. Questions that outlived borders, regimes, even her own body. She was not born from records, but from fracture, a splintering of identity, a sliver of uncertainty embedded so deeply into European history that even now it aches. She wandered from country to country, from courts to clinics. Her passport sometimes bore the name Anastasia Tchaikovsky, sometimes just A. She was received in salons and denounced in newspapers, supported by aristocrats, dismissed by scientists, never fully embraced, never fully exiled. She slept lightly, ate sparingly, kept windows half open even in winter. In moments of clarity, she would describe rooms that no longer existed, the velvet color of the Tsarina's favorite chaise, the pattern of frost on a palace window the night the revolution began. But then the cracks widened. She contradicted herself. Dates slipped. Names shifted. Once she claimed to remember Rasputin's eyes. Another time she said she'd never met him. Her accent bent in unexpected places. Her silences grew longer. She never seemed to want the crown or the wealth. She shunned interviews, refused staged appearances, lived modestly, often among stray cats and unwashed linen. In one diary entry, she wrote, "I am only waiting to stop waiting." Skeptics called her a fraud sustained by wishful monarchists and fading nostalgia. They dissected her timeline, highlighted her inconsistencies, published exposés. But there was something about her presence. It wasn't persuasive. It wasn't even coherent. It was persistent. One physician in Munich claimed she suffered from delusional disorder. Another said she showed no signs of psychosis, only deep fatigue. A third, who examined her for 10 years, concluded, if she is not who she says she is, she does not know that herself. And maybe that's where the fracture truly deepens, not between true and false, but between knowing and not knowing, between memory and identity, between the self and the echo that stands in its place. In 1968, she moved to a secluded estate in Virginia with the man who had become her final companion. They lived in near silence. She spoke to the birds, but not to visitors. Her hair whitened early. She often stared at photographs without naming them. Once during a thunderstorm, she wandered outside barefoot and whispered something in Russian too fast to be understood. She died in 1984. Her ashes were scattered in a forest she had never seen before. No monument, no epitaph. Only a metal box labeled AA, 1899-1984, possibly. Later, DNA would claim her body belonged to Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who suffered a head injury during World War I. The match was strong, almost definitive. Almost. But those who had known her, truly known her, said the match explained nothing. Not the eyes, not the silences, not the details she should not have known, not the unteachable poise with which she moved. There is a kind of knowing that resists data, a residue left behind in the corners of rooms in the way someone holds a cup in the quiet flinch when hearing a hymn from long ago. If she was not Anastasia, she was something else just as strange. Not an imposter. A mirror with no reflection. A wound shaped like a name. And even now in archives and memories, she sits quietly between pages, neither verified nor erased. Not a symbol, not a person, just the pause that never closes. There is a kind of silence in old palaces that speaks louder than memory. The empty halls of Vienna, the crumbling wallpaper in Hesse, the locked music room in a Windsor attic. Across Europe, rooms once meant for royalty grew cold in the wake of empire. Thrones still stood, but they were no longer occupied by certainty. After the Romanovs fell, the monarchies of Europe blinked, startled not by the death of a family, but by the sound it made a rupture low and long that echoed into their own mirrors. Kings still ruled, but their bloodlines trembled. The old alliances bound not by treaties but by intermarriage felt thinner, fragile. Into that nervous quiet stepped the shadow of a girl without a grave. Anastasia became something more than a person. She became a possibility, a name that carried not only grief but potential, the idea that not all was lost, that lineage could skip a bullet, that blue blood could outlive red revolution. Whispers passed from court to court, over tea, under candlelight. The idea grew that if the youngest daughter had escaped, then perhaps the line remained unbroken. Perhaps the Bolsheviks had not severed the root. It was not loyalty that drove these whispers. It was fear, and something older superstition perhaps hidden under silk and etiquette. Monarchies, after all, are built not just on law, but on myth. Letters were exchanged, private inquiries made. Retired officials were asked to revisit old reports. One dispatch from a Swedish consul in 1921 mentions a woman matching the height and bearing of Grand Duchess Anastasia, arriving under false documents in Copenhagen. The note ends abruptly, no further investigation advised. In Belgium, a former court tailor insisted he'd seen Anastasia shopping for ribbon in 1925, dressed modestly, accompanied by a man who addressed her as Altesse. In Spain, an ambassador's daughter claimed to have received a postcard signed only with a stylized A. No confirmations, only ripples. And behind closed doors, a darker theory stirred that someone in Europe knew. That the survival of Anastasia was not a mystery, but a guarded truth. Protected, hidden, preserved for later use, a card to be played if the Bolsheviks fractured, if Russia opened again to restoration. To claim her was to risk political instability. To deny her was to bury what could one day become leverage. So instead they watched, waited. Let the fog swirl around her. Some believe one of the Habsburgs offered her sanctuary. Others say a British lord paid annually for her silence. These stories share no source. They are stitched together from second-hand memoirs, marginalia, overheard train conversations. But isn't that the nature of a throne not sat upon to be defined by absence? In 1932, a sealed envelope was deposited into a Zurich bank vault by an unknown aristocrat. It was marked to be opened only upon confirmed proof of her death. Inside, reportedly, was a set of instructions, a title deed, a list of names. Some say it mentioned a child. The envelope remained sealed. Elsewhere, a Russian expatriate in France claimed to have embroidered a veil for the Romanov girl before her secret wedding in 1938. He remembered her hands not soft, but calloused. He said she hummed a lullaby he hadn't heard since his own childhood in St. Petersburg. Could all these be misremembrances? Collective grief projected onto strangers? Could be. But grief does not explain the coordination, the precision of the silences, the way so many of the records vanish at the same point, the same year, the same line redacted across multiple nations. Somewhere between Warsaw and Geneva, a name was erased, not forgotten, not lost, but deliberately removed. A bureaucratic act so quiet it echoes still. Anastasia did not need to be alive for the idea of her to survive. In the end, what is monarchy but continuity made flesh? And what is a missing duchess but a fracture that never heals. They watched for her in dreams, in corridors, in signatures written too carefully. And when she didn't arrive, they waited anyway. A throne can sit empty forever, but the shadow above it keeps growing. Some truths lie in blood, others in bone, but the most elusive seem to curl quietly inside the double helix, a spiral so small it cannot be seen by eye, yet vast enough to carry generations. When science stepped into the Romanov mystery, it did not arrive gently. It arrived with scalpels and centrifuges, with latex gloves and PCR machines. The human body, once buried in myth and ash, became a data point, each fragment labeled sampled sequenced. The first DNA tests conducted in the early 1990s aimed for closure. Comparison was made between the exhumed remains and living descendants of royal blood. Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Philip, was a distant maternal relative to Tsarina Alexandra. His DNA provided the baseline. At first the results seemed to align. The bones in the forest belonged to the Romanovs, or most of them. But two remained absent. The Tsarevich, one daughter. It was enough to reopen the cracks. The question was no longer just, did Anastasia survive? It became, can identity be extracted from degradation? Can memory exist in molecular form? Years passed. Technology improved. Bone fragments once considered too damaged were reanalyzed. Mitochondrial DNA inherited only from the mother offered clarity. Y chromosomes spoke of lineage, ratios, loci, markers. Eventually, in 2007, scientists announced that the two missing Romanov children had been found. Their remains buried near the others matched genetically. The case, they said, was closed. But closure is not always persuasive. Some scientists' quiet voices on the edges of the academic community raised concerns. Contamination, degraded samples, inconsistent protocols between Russian and Western labs. A few argued that the bone samples were too fragmented for definitive assignment. Others pointed to a subtler discrepancy. The mitochondrial DNA of one daughter reportedly diverged slightly from the expected sequence. Not a full mismatch, but an anomaly. A deviation small enough to be explained or questioned. How much room does science allow for ghosts? There was a time when to know a person meant to see them, hear them recognize their voice in a hallway. Now identity is stored in vials, in digitized genomes, in sequences archived on cold servers. But even these archives contain gaps. Some files from the early testing logs, calibration reports, intermediate data sets were lost in a fire at a Moscow lab in 2002. Others were never released to the public. Requests for transparency were met with delays, appeals unanswered. Skeptics returned to their theory: if a body never existed in the grave, how can one prove it was once there? At the edges of this controversy lies a deeper unease. That science, too, is susceptible to narrative. That the pressure to resolve a century-old mystery can bend even the steadiest instruments. In 2015, a group of independent geneticists attempted a blind reanalysis using samples taken from the official archives. The results confirmed the state's findings mostly, but one set of sequences came back flagged. The sample had degraded unevenly, possibly exposed to air, possibly mixed, possibly mishandled. It is a quiet word, but in questions of lineage it shouts. A decade later, a university in Krakow requested access to the remains for new testing using advanced proteomics. The request was denied. Why national dignity, religious sensitivity, exhaustion? The Russian Orthodox Church, still withholding full recognition of the recovered remains, has requested further verification, a strange twist where faith demands more proof than science is willing to provide. And beneath it all, the spiral continues to turn. In genetics, time folds differently. It is not linear, but recursive. Each cell is a record, each strand a whisper. What if somewhere in a clinic or cemetery, in a sealed vial or mislabeled box, there remains a sequence unclaimed, a signature misfiled? What if the story waits not in graveyards, but in freezers, in dust brushed from glass slides? The genome does not care for thrones, or names, or borders. But sometimes, when the code is just quiet enough, you can almost hear it breathe. Not proof, just possibility. There are rooms in every institution where paper goes to sleep. Not lost, just filed too carefully, labeled too vaguely, or dated just outside relevance. These are not secrets in the dramatic sense. They are omissions, gaps that were never meant to draw attention. In the archives of Interpol, beneath the expected layers of narcotics, forgeries, disappearances, and transnational crimes, there is a small cluster of files tagged with the phrase "unconfirmed royal identities." Most are fragments, brief reports, mismatched sightings, claims made by individuals without documents or names. But among them is a series from the 1960s and 1970s, marked in a handwriting now faded, referring to a subject known only as Case AR, a woman in Belgium, then in Sweden, then again in Canada. Always under different names, each time accompanied by a letter, anonymous, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in French, each claiming the same thing in different words: she is still alive. The reports were never followed up, not officially. Why would an international policing body take interest in a royal claim long considered myth? Because names, real names, have weight. And when one appears on forged passports more than once across 3 decades, attached to faces that resemble a dead girl, curiosity becomes protocol. A document dated 1972, originating in Lyon, describes an intercepted passport bearing the name Anastasia T. Voronina. The birth year, 1901. The place of origin, Tobolsk. The passport photo shows a woman in her 60s eyes, slightly misaligned signature carefully curved. The file is closed with the note, "No further action required." Subject released. Released. But released to whom? Another record, undated, missing its first page, refers to an inquiry from a private entity in the UK requesting fingerprint verification on a woman then residing in rural Bavaria. The reply: no prints on file. No grounds for extraction. Somewhere a name had become too heavy to hold. In 1981, an internal memo declassified accidentally and later redacted mentions renewed interest in the Romanov case, following media coverage of a royal autobiography published in Austria. The book itself is banal. But in the margin of one chapter, the author references the girl with the injured hip who never spoke above a whisper. Interpol's response: silence. Silence can be policy. A retired agent interviewed anonymously in the early 2000s claimed that certain cases were designated archival distractions, not meant to be solved, merely to be monitored. Kept alive like low embers in the corner of a file room, just in case the wind changed. Why would the Romanov mystery fall into this category? Because too many governments had touched it. Because too many versions of the story existed. Because every declaration of truth only multiplied disbelief. And because perhaps she was never meant to be found. Not as an individual, not as a case, but as a vessel for something else, a thread in the loom of post-war power. A thread that could be pulled if needed, or buried if not. In the shadow corridors of international law enforcement identification is currency. But what happens when identity itself is blurred beyond retrieval? When it becomes not a matter of facts, but of belief. Interpol was not in the business of belief, but it knew how to wait. And so Case AR remains, scanned, indexed, dormant. The fingerprints, if they ever existed, are missing. The photographs poorly copied. The conclusions absent. Only a closing line typed faintly on the final page, status unresolved, relevance uncertain, probability persistent. No closure, no denial, just a silence that knew how to file itself. They say every lost identity calls forth echoes, and the longer it remains unclaimed, the more those echoes multiply, not in clarity, but in hunger. After the fall of the Romanovs, a strange ledger began to form, written not in ink alone, but in voices and gestures and borrowed memories. A list of women, dozens at first, then many more, each stepping forward from the margins of war-torn Europe to say, I am her. I am Anastasia. They came from sanatoriums, convents, orphanages, from train stations and border camps, each bearing some fragment that felt true. A scar. A name mispronounced just right. A lullaby known only to the imperial nursery. The earliest appeared in 1919, barely a year after the cellar in Yekaterinburg fell silent. She arrived in Romania, dazed, escorted by a man who swore he had rescued her from Bolshevik captivity. The local papers printed her photograph beside an old portrait of the Grand Duchess. The resemblance was striking but fleeting. A few weeks later, she vanished. The next was in Poland, then another in Prague, then two in France. The claims overlapped, each more elaborate than the last. Some spoke Russian, others not a word. Some seemed to remember things no child should forget. Others couldn't recall their own birthdays, and yet none could be dismissed outright. A few were supported by nobles still loyal to the throne. Others were mocked, ridiculed, cast out as opportunists. One was institutionalized after refusing to respond to any name but Anastasia Nikolaevna. She wrote letters in invisible ink, spoke to mirrors, and insisted she had once met Kaiser Wilhelm II in a dream. Skeptics called it madness, a mass delusion, a performance of grief. But patterns emerged. Across languages and continents, the impostors shared certain details, references to rooms that had been destroyed, knowledge of pet names, family mannerisms. The kind of knowledge not found in books, not easily fabricated. One woman living under the name Vera Klonovska in Belgium possessed a ring engraved with a crest long believed melted down after the revolution. Another in Buenos Aires accurately described the location of a secret drawer in a Romanov writing desk. A drawer later verified by historians locked and untouched for 70 years. How? Coincidence, conspiracy, or something else? The French press eventually labeled them les fausses princesses, the false princesses. But even that name failed to capture their impact. They weren't trying to reclaim the throne. Most asked for nothing. No money. No recognition. Only to be believed. Only to stop floating. A Catholic priest in Bavaria kept a notebook titled Children of the Snow, cataloging each woman who claimed the name Anastasia. His entries were brief. One line for each eyes like glass, refused to eat with silver, sang Orthodox hymns during seizures, held my hand and whispered, "Don't tell them I'm still here." The ledger now sits in an archive, brittle and incomplete. The ink fades, but the entries continue to unsettle. Because even now historians cannot explain how so many separate claims carried the same errors. Not facts errors, details not widely known but repeated nonetheless. A misquoted verse, a reversed date, the same hesitation before saying Yekaterinburg. It was as if memory itself had splintered, scattered across lives that had no business touching. Modern psychology calls it identity fusion, a trauma-born phenomenon where victims of war and dislocation unconsciously adopt lost narratives to survive. But what if survival sometimes moves in the other direction? What if memory seeks vessels, and yet the ledger has no conclusion? Only pages, only entries, only fading descriptions of faces that looked close, but not quite. Like someone waking from a dream and trying to remember their own name before it vanishes. In the end, perhaps none of them were Anastasia, or perhaps all of them were in the only way that mattered, as keepers of a thread unraveled by bullets, as reminders that not all deaths are confirmed by graves. The ledger remains open, not because it expects another name, but because it never held the right one. She had a scar behind her left ear, faint silvery, curved like a crescent moon. When asked about it, she would touch it without speaking. Some said it was from a fall. Others whispered it came from the butt of a rifle, or a bayonet thrust that missed its mark. But Anastasia Romanoff, according to the family doctor's notes, had no such scar. This mismatch minor, almost forgettable, became a hinge. On one side, a story of survival. On the other, a dissonant detail. And yet she spoke with a voice that paused in familiar places. Its rhythm held the tension of someone once taught to wait before answering. Its pitch dipped into cadences that seemed borrowed from another era, formal, deliberate, too practiced to be accidental. People who met her described an odd sensation that she was both unfamiliar and deeply known, that she reminded them of someone they had never met. A Russian tutor living in Paris swore she recited Pushkin with the inflection of a palace child, not a village girl. He could not prove it. He could only repeat the line she once murmured to herself when she believed no one was listening. In silence, my memory sings. But memories, like scars, are hard to verify. One day she was asked to identify a piece of jewelry, a Fabergé egg once rumored lost during the flight from Tobolsk. She studied it for a long time, fingers motionless, then said, "This one was my sister's. Mine was green." No one had mentioned color. Another time someone played a phonograph recording of the Tsar speaking one of the few audio fragments left. Her hands trembled. She stood up, then sat down. Said nothing for hours. Some called it performance, others proof, but most couldn't say either way. Her scar, that persistent crescent, appeared in every medical record, unchanged across decades. It was noted, sketched, photographed, compared, never explained. A specialist once claimed the scar was surgical, likely from an abscess drained in childhood. Romanoff medical records list no such procedure. But one nurse recalled in an unpublished memoir an emergency in the winter of 1910. A fever, a wound that bled behind the ear. The page was torn out. The rest of the entry missing. Did the scar come from that moment? Or was it coincidence wrapped in hope? Some wounds arrive before memory forms. Others shape memory itself. Later, when voice analysis became possible, an old recording of her just one was tested against archival fragments believed to contain Anastasia's speech. The results were inconclusive. Too much degradation. Too few reference points. But one researcher privately wrote in his log, the pauses match, and the hesitation on mother. Was that enough? The weight of her claim always returned to small details, a gesture, a glance, the way she folded linen, as if she'd once been taught by someone who folded for a queen. She was not precise. She never told the same story twice. But her imprecision felt lived in, like someone who remembered in waves, not lines. One evening, when asked again if she was the lost duchess, she said, "If I am not her, then I have lost more than anyone." That too became a hinge. Some believed she spoke as a fraud who had become her own fiction. Others more quietly believed she spoke as someone who had been displaced from herself. Not pretending, just dislocated. A scar doesn't prove survival, but it marks what tried to be erased. And a voice doesn't have to match exactly to make the air tremble in recognition. Some letters are never meant to be read. They are written to quiet the mind, to push back the tide of memory, or to place a seal on something that will never be spoken aloud. One such letter, unsigned and never sent, was discovered in a sealed envelope behind the plaster of a rural farmhouse in Smolensk during a restoration in 1998. It was written in pencil. The handwriting shook not from age, but from fear. Dated August 1918. "They said she was dead. I saw her move." The rest of the letter spirals. Sentences fragment. Thoughts loop. The name Anastasia never appears, but the phrase "the small one with eyes like the Tsarina" repeats more than once. References are made to a third carriage, a silent room beyond the cellar, and finally a note that reads, "Simply the man in white gave me the cipher. He said, 'Wait until winter.'" The letter was authenticated by paper and ink analysts, matched to materials accessible only to the military in mid-1918. Some dismissed it as the rambling of a broken mind, but the envelope bore a stamp not from the Postal Service, but a military seal traced to the 2nd Ural Rifle Regiment, a unit known to be stationed near Yekaterinburg. A regiment with multiple deserters in the weeks following the Romanov execution. No one ever claimed authorship. But the cipher mentioned in the letter wasn't forgotten. Historians had long speculated that certain Romanov loyalists used encoded signals to transmit messages about survivors' sequences of symbols embedded in embroidery or poems or even liturgical chants. One such sequence was discovered inside the binding of a hymnal from a closed Orthodox monastery in Vologda. It read, "Three crossed, one veiled one unsung." Scholars dismissed it as metaphor, but a few believed it referred to escape 3 daughters dead, one missing, one concealed. The language was too deliberate, the placement too precise. Elsewhere in the archives of a now-defunct German intelligence unit, a coded message intercepted in 1920 contained the phrase, "AN alive. Passage secured. Awaiting frost." The cipher was broken decades later, but the origin of the message was never confirmed. No recipient, no sender, only static wrapped in suspicion. Ciphers are not truths. They are shapes designed to delay clarity. But when clarity is dangerous, delay becomes preservation. Somewhere beneath the machinery of revolution, of exile, of archives burned and rewritten, there remains this flicker that the Romanov execution was not final for all. That someone, a guard, a nurse, a sympathizer, acted against instruction. A loud breath where there should have been stillness. Moved a body where there should have been a grave. And when that movement was discovered, a new set of ciphers began not to communicate, but to contain. The deserter's letter never names names, but it hints at a transaction, a silence bought or stolen, a rescue half fulfilled. The phrase, "wait until winter," appears twice. Some take it to mean literal winter, a time of migration. Others believe it's symbolic, that truth like ice must be walked upon carefully lest it crack too soon. Later, a Russian exile living in Chicago claimed to possess a notebook filled with ciphers transcribed from a dying comrade who had once guarded the Ipatiev house. The notebook vanished after the man's death. His apartment was emptied by a private agency. No inventory was filed. Still in private collections, fragments remain. Crosses marked in 5-point sequences, stars inverted and circled. A line of stitching inside a child's coat recovered from a Polish antique market that, when viewed under ultraviolet light, reveals the initials AN flanked by the number 718. July 1918. Could these be coincidence? Certainly. Could they be meaning? Only if meaning is allowed to exist beyond verification. The deserter's letter ends abruptly. I dream of her walking through snow, not looking back. Not once. The page below is blank, not torn, not burned, just left open. A space where an answer might have been. Or perhaps a space where an answer was never safe. Some relics are kept not for what they prove, but for what they refuse to confirm. In a private chapel outside Krakow, there lies an icon of the Virgin Mary, its surface dulled by time and incense. At its base is a small, ornate cross, golden narrow set with dull green stones. The cross is not native to the chapel. It appeared sometime in the 1930s, anonymously donated. No records, no ceremony, only a note folded beneath its velvet lining for the child who wasn't lost but veiled. The style of the cross matches those commissioned by Empress Alexandra in 1916. Personal gifts, worn beneath clothes close to the skin. Most were destroyed. Some were looted. This one resurfaced. The Romanov family was known for devotional jewelry. Their crosses were rarely mere ornaments. They carried engravings, prayers, initials, secret inscriptions. The backs were smooth, brushed in platinum. This one bore no name. But beneath the emerald in its center, a sliver of paper had been folded tightly and sealed with wax. It remained undiscovered for nearly 70 years. When it was finally examined in the late 1990s, the wax crumbled. Inside, a thread. Just a thread. Pale green, coarse, likely linen. Beneath it, 5 words in a nearly invisible script. She went through the velvet. Velvet, a word that recurs in accounts of the Romanovs' final months. The daughters were said to have sewn jewels into the velvet linings of their corsets and hems. Their final layers became burial shrouds and armor both. But velvet also appeared in another context, whispered among certain émigrés in Vienna and Prague, the Velvet Exchange. A name given to a rumored operation among loyalists to smuggle survivors of noble birth across borders under the guise of domestic workers or displaced persons. The phrase is always half-formed, referenced, avoided. In one file from the British Foreign Office, declassified in 2009, a report dated December 1919 describes a young woman apprehended at Dover wearing a faded maid's uniform and carrying a cross too valuable for her story. When asked, she claimed she had found it near Warsaw. When pressed, she fell silent. She was released the next day. No further documentation. The same cross, perhaps. In Brussels, a box was found in 1964 in the attic of a former Orthodox priest. Inside a child's pair of gloves, a lock of brown hair tied in ribbon, and a swatch of deep blue velvet. Tucked within its folds, an embroidered phrase in Old Church Slavonic. God hides what men destroy. No name, no origin. The artifacts were quietly donated to a museum mislabeled as post-war memorabilia. But the stitching, the thread matched the thread beneath the Krakow cross. Coincidence or remnants of a continuity that never declared itself. Religious symbols have long been used to carry secrets. In times of persecution, a cross was not only a sign of faith, it was a seal, a code, a key. The Romanovs knew this. They had cloaked themselves in ritual, in symbols, in the liturgies of protection. And when those protections shattered, something may have been passed along, not spoken, but sown. And velvet, too, can be weapon and disguise. In the house of special purpose. One of the only untouched items found after the execution was a velvet-bound prayer book. Its pages stuck together, its clasp broken. Hidden in the spine was a fragment of a map, only partial. The Ural Mountains, a red dot where no town had ever existed. Later, Soviet officials denied the book's relevance. The map, they said, was meaningless. But in a confiscated letter dated 1922, addressed to a woman in Dresden under the name Anya V., one line stands out. The book closed, but the velvet still breathes. Velvet holds scent longer than most fabrics. It remembers touch. It frays slowly, but it does fray. A cross switched, a note hidden, a thread carried across continents. Perhaps it was only a gesture, or perhaps it was the last remaining pathway for someone who could not return through names. Some messages are not spoken. They are not written either. They pass in the blink of an eye, in the narrowing of fingers, in the twitch of a shoulder at the wrong moment. These are languages without alphabets, born in rooms where voices are dangerous, where speech becomes a liability. Among the fragments of the post-Romanov world lies a thread of such a language, a mute transmission passed not through ink, but through gesture. A series of movements. A tap of the thumb against the knuckle. A slight turn of the wrist. Repeated across time in unlikely places. The first official record of this appeared in a Red Cross intake form in 1920. A Russian girl, orphaned and sickly, brought to a medical camp in Bucharest, was noted to refuse all verbal communication, but repeats hand signals that resemble neither standard sign language nor known regional dialect. The nurse who wrote the report had served briefly as a caretaker at Tsarskoe Selo. She believed the girl was using a code once taught to the Romanov children by their English tutor, a playful invention turned into necessity. The nurse called it the unspoken alphabet. The file ends there. The girl was transferred. Her name disappears. But that sequence of gestures appears again. In 1923, a court stenographer in Berlin witnessed a woman heavily veiled, unwell, communicating with her companion using hand signals. The stenographer, curious, documented the pattern, and later, while transcribing unrelated wartime interviews, noticed the same series, repeated by a former palace footman speaking of his time in Tobolsk. He drew it out on the margin of his notes. Thumb touch. Palm open. two fingers crossed. Beneath it he wrote, "Not random." Then silence. Years later, a historian researching lost languages of the Russian diaspora came across a 1935 letter held in an archive in Rome. It was written by a Polish linguist who believed he had encountered a young woman using what he termed an inherited code of trauma. She drew maps using hand signals alone. One such map was copied crude, inconsistent, yet curiously detailed. It outlined a wooded area near Perm, a clearing, a stream, a small stone marker. That marker was never found, but the map matched one recovered in a monastery in Finland, hidden beneath the floorboards of a guest room once used by Russian refugees. The two maps overlapped, different lines, same curve, same clearing. Who had drawn the original, and why had its shape been repeated not with pen, but with body? Cartographers dismiss it. Without coordinates, it is nothing. Without legend, it is unreadable. But memory, when stripped of language, finds other vessels. In 1952, a deaf child admitted to a hospital in Warsaw repeatedly used a hand signal no one could interpret. It was not part of any formal sign language, not Polish, not Russian. It involved tracing a circle over the heart, followed by a downward arc palm open. The signal matches exactly a notation found in a diary belonging to a woman known only as N.A., confiscated by German authorities in 1942. The diary itself is nearly empty, just 12 pages. But on the inside cover, a sketch of a girl holding up two fingers, her mouth closed, eyes wide. No name, no date. Some believe the signal meant safe. Others say alive. Still others believe it simply meant not yet. But no consensus was reached. Across refugee communities, these signals were passed like heirlooms. A touch on the wrist that meant don't speak. A knock on wood that meant move now. A sideways glance that meant remember but do not say. The Romanovs, surrounded by servants, guards, watchers, had long practiced saying nothing aloud. Their lives from exile to execution were crowded with eyes that did not blink. So perhaps it was not surprising that what survived wasn't a story or a voice or even a name, but a gesture. A language made to be remembered by the body when the mind was no longer safe. And somewhere in that silent choreography a map was drawn, not on paper, not with ink, but in the nervous systems of those who had seen and lived and could not speak. A map that never made it to the archives, but perhaps still lingers in the hands of someone who has long since forgotten why they flinch the way they do. There is a monastery in southeastern Poland, its stones soot-darkened, its bells long muted. It does not appear in tourist guides or on maps marked in bold. Most who pass it believe it to be abandoned. The monks speak rarely. When they do, their voices stay within the stone. Beneath its chapel lies a vault, and beneath the vault a passage blocked by a wooden door with no visible handle sealed from the other side. It was rediscovered by accident in 1971 during repairs after a winter storm. Behind the door, a single chamber. No windows, no bed, no markings, save for a carved cross above the lintel and the faint scent of wax, and a single sheet of vellum. It bore a handwritten prayer unfinished. The language was Old Church Slavonic, but the grammar fractured midway. The script trembled as if the hand that wrote it was unfamiliar with stillness. The final line trails off mid-sentence, "Let the silence hold her name." No signature, no date. But the ink tested to the 1920s. The wax found in the corners matched a blend used by Russian Orthodox monks during wartime rare bitter smelling mixed with myrrh and ash. In the room, nothing else. No bedding. No remnants of occupation. Only air that did not move and walls that seemed built for forgetting. And yet in a hidden alcove behind one of the bricks disturbed during a second restoration, in 1983, a fragment of cloth was found. Navy blue. Edged in embroidery, threadbare but deliberate. The initials stitched there were faint but legible. Einar. 3 letters. Too coincidental to dismiss, too quiet to confirm. The monks would not speak of it. When asked, they simply recited verses that held no answers. But one older than the rest was overheard whispering, "She never opened her eyes in daylight." Was it metaphor memory, or something? He was not meant to carry this long. In Warsaw's ecclesiastical archives, a restricted file references a female penitent of uncertain origin given shelter by the church between 1922 and 1927. Her records are redacted, her confessions sealed, her final destination unknown. But a margin note written in faint Latin reads, "Transferred to silent order at Pivnitsna. Condition fragile. Mind inconsistent." Pivnitsna, the nearest settlement to the monastery, with the sealed room. Elsewhere in a discarded journal belonging to a Belgian theologian, there's mention of a nun who arrived without vows, who refused to speak, who wept during every liturgy but would not say why. He writes, she fasts without reason. Her silence is not discipline, it is displacement. Her name is not given, only the initial A. The Romanovs were not devout in the common sense. Their faith was woven into tradition, not fervor. But Anastasia was said to have whispered prayers before sleep, not recited, whispered, as if uncertain which part of her soul would be heard. A priest in exile, in a letter dated 1954, claims to have heard a voice during confession unlike any other soft-accented hesitant. The woman never revealed her name. But at the end, she asked one question. If a person forgets their own death, do they still need forgiveness? The letter ends there. There are those who believe the sealed room in the monastery was not a prison, but a refuge. A place not to hide from the world, but from memory itself. A space built not to contain a body, but a name. And perhaps that is where history folds in rooms where names are not spoken aloud, where prayers are left unfinished, not because they were interrupted, but because to finish them would mean admitting something survived. There is no plaque on the door, no record of who sealed it. The monks now walk past it without turning their heads. Only the wind seems to pause there, as if listening for the rest of the sentence that was never written. The chapel stood at the edge of a forest in northern France, where fog did not drift, but settled, as if exhaling slowly. It had no congregation, no schedule, no bells. Only a wooden door that never locked, and a stone floor worn down by steps that no records recalled. In the winter of 1951, a funeral was held there. Brief, unannounced, witnessed by 5 people whose names do not appear together in any registry. No priest presided. No scripture was read aloud. The coffin arrived by cart, not hearse, unmarked, unblessed. The woman who organized the burial signed the guest book with a single letter V. The grave was dug quietly before dawn. The coffin lowered without ceremony. The inscription on the simple iron plate read only, "A traveler." returned. Locals remembered the cart, the horse, the silence. One child, then 8 years old, would later recall a woman standing just outside the chapel's door, tall, unmoving, veiled in black, her gloved hands pressed together though not in prayer. She left before the final shovelful of earth. The coffin was standard size, but the fabric lining described by the gravedigger in a forgotten interview was of deep green velvet, the same shade described in exile-era accounts of Romanov mourning cloth. Inside the coffin was a woman of indeterminate age. Her features, pale preserved, bore no signs of trauma. Her hands were clasped. A ring found on her left index finger bore a faded crest, later identified as belonging to a long-defunct branch of the Russian nobility. When catalogued, the crest was noted, then quietly erased from the archive. Years later, when a historian attempted to trace the burial permit, he found only a blank ledger page. No permit was ever issued. No parish record exists. But the grave remains. It has no flowers, no caretakers, only a headstone placed 5 years after the burial bearing a single line, "Here lies what would not remain lost." No one visits, but every spring someone leaves a sprig of lily of the valley tucked into the crevice beneath the stone. Always the same flower, always without a note. In 1977, an anonymous letter arrived at the Russian embassy in Paris. Written in looping script, it read, "You buried her in silence. But silence is not the absence of story." The letter was filed, then misplaced. It was never investigated. Over the decades, rumors surfaced that the woman in the coffin had once lived in a sanatorium in Austria, that she'd spoken only to birds, that she had once drawn a map in the dust of a window pane shaped like the Ural Mountains, then erased it with her palm, that she answered to no name. One archivist claimed to have found a photograph in the belongings of a diplomat's widow, a photo of a funeral with no people, just a closed coffin, a veil folded over its top, a velvet ribbon pinned to the side. The photograph vanished from the archive in 1992. No one insists this was Anastasia. No one asserts. No one confirms. But the funeral, small, wordless, veiled, remains like an imprint on a sheet already burned. Some deaths are not registered because there was never proof of life. And some burials do not close anything at all. They mark the place where a question was allowed to rest, but not to end. In the laboratories of forensic clarity, blood is not metaphor. It is data, percentages, alleles, chains of chemical inheritance. It is mapped, catalogued, sequenced. And yet even here, where truth is reduced to code, something resists. The Romanov DNA profile was meant to end the questions, to close the cellar, to silence the dust. In the 1990s, samples from the Ekaterinburg grave were tested across multiple nations. Mitochondrial DNA passed through maternal lines matched the living descendants of Queen Victoria. Nuclear DNA linked the bones to Tsar Nicholas. Chromosomes arranged themselves into a lineage long thought severed. And still something didn't align. 2 of the Romanov children were missing from the initial grave. When remains believed to be theirs surfaced in 2007, testing resumed. Scientists pointed to matching sequences. Statistics swelled. Graphs drew confidence in straight lines. But beneath the smooth surface of certainty, the numbers murmured. There were inconsistencies in the degradation curves. One of the Y chromosomal markers in the supposed Tsarevich's remains showed mutation patterns unexpected in a boy of his age. The femur showed growth plates that suggested a different nutrition timeline than his documented health would allow. It was small, marginal, a decimal here, a deviation there. Enough to be dismissed, not enough to be forgotten. A private team unaffiliated with any state reviewed the data sets in 2011. Their conclusion: genetic continuity assumed but not indisputable. A footnote, buried on page 14. But once read, it could not be unread. Blood, after all, is not passive. It moves, it carries, and sometimes it masks. In a handwritten memo found in a now decommissioned Russian lab, a technician scrawled, "Second sample does not match first. No context, no initials, dated in pencil." The rest of the logbook water-damaged the pages stuck together. Elsewhere, a misfiled shipping manifest in a UK university archive lists duplicate remains for off-site verification in 1995. The receiving lab has no record of ever receiving them. Questions emerged. Were the samples swapped? Were they combined? Were they curated? The Russian Orthodox Church, despite government endorsements, withheld its recognition of the recovered remains. Not out of disbelief, but doubt. Holy relics must be certain. These were not. The bodies did not bless themselves. In 2015, a petition surfaced, signed by a group of royalists, academics, and forensic anthropologists requesting independent re-exhumation. It was quietly rejected. No reason given. The grave remained sealed. In interviews, some scientists shifted from words like proof to confidence, from confirmation to high likelihood, a softening, a retreat from absolutes. Meanwhile, in private collections, in attics and briefcases, documents tell quieter stories. A letter unsigned, addressed to a diplomat in Switzerland in 1958, speaks of a bloodline interrupted but not erased. Another found tucked into a prayer book in a Munich church reads, "The daughter carries nothing visible, but her silence hums." Even as tests repeat and protocols are refined, one truth remains untestable: identity is more than what bleeds. If Anastasia survived, and if a body was placed in her stead who arranged it, why protect a name only to hide it? Was it to shield her, or to maintain a myth? DNA cannot answer what was not asked. It does not explain why. It measures resemblance, not recognition. And recognition in the end comes not through sequences, but through the space where the line breaks. A name in the blood crossed out, not erased, only displaced. There are mirrors that hang not to show, but to absorb. Glass worn so thin it no longer gives back the face, only the light. In the final room of the last known Romanov residence, that house in Ekaterinburg, since demolished, since sanctified, there was such a mirror. It stood in the corridor outside the cellar. Small, cracked at the edge. It is not mentioned in official inventories. Only one account from a guard who later vanished into the war speaks of it. She looked at it before going down, and did not look away. When the house was torn down in 1977, under orders no longer traceable, the mirror was removed, but not destroyed. A worker kept it. Or so the story goes. It reappeared decades later in an estate sale in Nizhny Novgorod, framed in warped wood, the glass too dulled to be decorative. A collector unaware of its origin bought it for less than the cost of the frame. And then returned it, said it made the rooms colder. It now rests in a museum storage room, unlabeled, Some say if you look into it too long, the contours of your face disappear. Not all at once, just softly, as though the mirror chooses not to remember you. And maybe that is what happened to her. Not death, not survival, but a slow subtraction from reflection. Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanova, fourth daughter of the last Tsar, occupies no certain space. She exists in the interstice between burial and escape, between silence and claim, between blood and its echo. All that was known dissolved under too much retelling. The line of succession ends with a sentence not completed. The face most recognized is the one most denied. She became possibility, not through fiction, but through absence. Her presence was never required, only her potential. Every unanswered letter, every veiled woman in exile, every scar that did not match every voice that almost did, all formed the outline of a person who might have lived. A breath against the mirror's surface, never quite clearing the fog. And in that breath, a name that was spoken too often and never enough. Today, in archives and cathedrals, in sealed rooms and sealed graves, the mystery has been declared over. But resolution is not silence, and silence does not mean forgetting. It means there is a room still closed, a line still blurred, a mirror still standing. And within it not a girl, not a princess, not even a myth, but something else. The shape of what should have never remained unanswered. The light that bends where her reflection should be. And it does not say yes, and it does not say no. It only holds the question. Longer than anyone expected,